A lot in the medium-term budget policy statement today, joined now by Isaah Mahlanga, Chief Economist at Alexander Forbes. Isaah, good afternoon to you. I mean, the question we all want to know as a nation is, are we going in a particular direction? Are we going to see more spending on education? Are we going to see a basic income grant? Are we going to see enabling conditions for growth? I don't know, did we get a direction? Do you see a direction from today's speech?
Look, those are all good to have, provided we have the purse to actually finance them. Let me perhaps give you an anecdote. Fiscal consolidation was also visible in the food packs that we economists that attend the lockup normally get. In the pre-COVID-19 world, we had been used to a buffet of lamb chops, chicken, meatballs, fruit salads, a variety of soft drinks, and cake for dessert. What we got today, it was a cheese sandwich, an orange yogurt, a chicken wrap, an orange juice, and a lunch bar. That is quite, interesting, especially if you just look at the downgrade of the menu of things that was available. So if you also look at the medium-term budget policy statement, it shows a continued fiscal consolidation path that was set by the former Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana. And just to use the anecdote Mr. Godongwana used is to say, between the two of them, the difference is he has, better shoes. And indeed, if we just look from a tax revenue collection, he had to work with 120 billion rand more than budgeted for, while the former Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana had to work with 100 billion rand more than what was budgeted for in the previous MTBPS relative to the budget. So indeed, he's slightly in a better environment. But what we see is a continuation of the framework that was set already by Minister Godongwana in the budget, which is good, particularly if we're looking from a market's point of view, but also if you're looking from a business point of view. The outcome from the budget is actually quite positive.
The Minister talking particularly about growth, how important it is. We know that for him, he said in the past in interviews before the speech, that is the priority. But is this speech creating enabling conditions for growth? And I mean, within all of that, of course, is electricity, not that we have much of that.
Indeed, we didn't hear much of talk around electricity or Eskom. I don't think there is anything new that he would have told us that we don't know already. But what is more important, I think the growth story that you allude to is the more important aspect that we were waiting to hear from the Finance Minister. And as far as that is concerned, there's a number of economic reforms that are now scheduled for implementation in 2022. Unlike the years that were coming from where reforms had no, time frames, this time around we now have time frames to measure the success or failure, of implementation of these reforms. You can think about, Transnet rail freights, its acceptance that the private sector needs to play a role and use its railway line as third-party players that is going to shift goods from roads to rail and also increase the volume and capacity of what can be transported into our ports for exports. That's very good, again scheduled for 2022. You can also think about Spectrum, which has been delayed. There is now some dates that have been provided, and on top of that, you can think about other reforms in the water sector, which is the next big, shock to the economy should we not manage it properly. Also scheduled for implementation in 2022. So a number of these reforms can generate or can build confidence among businesses, among the private sector participants, both onshore and offshore. But we need to see them implemented for us to gain that confidence. So a growth story or a growth narrative is emerging, but it's still work in progress.
Well, Isaah, I mean, if you look at the speech, March next year is the deadline for, I think, 3 different things around Spectrum, around private trains running on railway tracks, the private companies transporting cargo on railway tracks owned by Transnet, also, of course, for the digital migration of television. If we get to the 1st of April, do you think they're all going to be done by then?
Look, that's what we hope is going to be done. Failure to stick to your own timelines means you are going to lose credibility. which is not in plentiful supply at this point in time. So there is an incentive for government to actually implement before those 8 days. But I think the other aspect also that we may need to take into account that is quite positive is there was no commitment for new social spending without tax revenues. It was said in no uncertain terms that we would not commit to permanent spending on the basis of temporary revenue overperformance, which is quite positive. So tying whatever spending that politicians might want, such as the basic income grant, which for all intents and purposes, it's necessary in the current environment where people are losing jobs, where the impact of the pandemic has actually made people's lives worse, but it needs to be tied with a long-term growth story and funding mechanism that makes it sustainable. And the budget, the midterm budget says in no specific, in no uncertain terms that we are not going to commit to it until we have identified revenue sources. And again, for this year, it might have been pushed because of the 5% economic growth. Next year, that is now not going to be the discussion. We will be talking about a sub 2% economic growth, which means the talk of revenues outperforming is not going to be available to put some fire into these kinds of debates.
We all know about the financial pressures of a basic income grant, but it would seem the political pressures for that are just going to grow. Do you think, based on what we've seen today, that by the budget next year, the budget speech early next year, he's going to have no choice?
Look, we always have choices, but unfortunately the choices are the hard ones, where we need to prioritize things that actually boost long-term economic growth, and that is not social spending. It is spending on investment, which is what we see also in the budget. If you look in terms of the projections for gross fixed capital formation, they go from contracting for 3 consecutive years or even more before the pandemic to growing consecutively over the next 3 years. If you look at government spending, it goes from growing positively in the 3 years before the pandemic to contracting for 3 consecutive years in the medium-term expenditure framework, which is the right type of restructuring of the budget away from current consumption towards investment, because that is ultimately what boosts long-term productivity of the economy. That is what ultimately can increase jobs rather than a government-driven job creation mechanism.
Isaah Mahlanga, thanks very much indeed, Chief Economist at Alexander Forbes. Your reaction, I do appreciate it today. Well, the final